Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, and for the first video back in a while, well, proper video I suppose, I thought I'd cover something that harkens somewhat to IKRPG, thanks to the Kickstarter campaign, that is, at time of publishing, due to or recently finished. My scheduling is still a mess. That and keeps things simple with a topic that is usually considered a footnote in the world-building process for game settings, much like newspapers as covered previously. The judicial systems of a setting are usually only brought up when it's pertinent within a narrative, and typically there's only an overview of the major nation's approach to judging the severity of transgressions and what would be considered suitable punishments for said transgressions. Naturally, this varies from nation to nation, as does the zeal with which their respective laws are enforced, and it's quite intriguing to study, as with other aspects that would otherwise be considered non-gameplay relevant. As one would expect, there isn't much by way of artwork relating to this particular topic, so I'll do the best I can, and that's sort of what I meant by keep things simple. But anyway, what follows is a quick look at how the various peoples and nations of Western Immoren administer justice. Predictably, civilization came up with many and varied ways to keep the peace in their respective realms, though some were more codified than others. In the Iron Kingdoms, developing, keeping, and enforcing the laws that the ruling institutions pass to their citizens has become its own industry of sorts, and magistrates, barristers, and other agents of the law operate within each jurisdiction, most effectively in urban centres, while rural areas are possessed of perhaps more parochial rule of law, declared, judged, and enforced by elders, or what have you. While most laws tend to be quite provincial, with certain crimes given differing weight depending on where one resides, even within the same country, some are of enough import that they are passed at national level. However, despite the laws of nations, most tensions between countries and political wrangling often mean that a nation's lawmakers and judiciary is distracted by events of a greater scale than mere petty thefts or, say, the occasional sacrificial murder. Indeed, many city watches will not care to investigate crimes unless they themselves witness it, and depending on the perpetrator, they may even turn a blind eye. Certain cities are more prone to such behaviour, of course. Thus, the common people often turn to the more zealous of the religious leadership in aiding them see justice, and again certain areas will see this more commonly as part of the local culture than others. What is universal across Western Immoren, however, is that judges take a dim view of almost everything, if only because they must, given the continual upheaval that many locales go through, and the inevitable civil disobedience that accompanies such upheaval. And where there isn't continual upheaval, the judges are naturally inclined to take a dim view of things anyway. As such, due to the wildly differing local laws and law enforcement's predilection towards giving short shrift to anything they perceive as petty, travellers are duly warned. Be aware of the foibles, shall we say, of your destination, legal and otherwise. Or don't be surprised if you get robbed, conned, or extorted. It is little surprise that the vast majority of successful merchants conduct their excursions with armed guards or mercenaries. I digress. On to particulars. Elven justice generally differs only between Iosen and Nis. With the closing of Ios's borders, Elven trust of non-elves is unsurprisingly low, so those who are caught within their borders are treated with little by way of clemency. Summary execution is normal, while branding and expulsion is lenient. Among themselves, however, with the desire to hearken to the days of the Iosen Empire, even after so many millennia, Iosen court procedures and trials are an elaborate affair, with equal time provided to both plaintiff and the accused, and Iosens are driven to draw the fairest possible conclusions. Punishments vary, but execution is reserved for the most heinous of crimes, such as heresy like on the scale of the cult of Nero, and the treason of Lord Gearshield of House Fire, up to and including the War of the Houses. For the vast majority of crimes and legal matters, the Iosen judicial system is overseen by the courts at the three largest cities, Sheer, Iris, and Linchinal, though Sheer takes precedent over the other two, and for higher-profile trials, for obvious reasons. Thanks to their far fewer numbers and mountain hinterlands, before the unblighted remnants reunited with their Iosen cousins, the Nis never possessed a centralized legal system. As such, they are much more judicial and ritualized in their approach to conflict resolution, and they attach much importance to individual status in deciding punishments. However, now that the Nis and Iosen live within the same borders once again, the Nis abide by Iosen norms due to the disparity in their populations, and the Nis peacemakers, as their arbiters are known as, no doubt have set about studying the Iosen legal codes. though one suspects that among themselves and away from Ios and Eyes, the Nists maintain their traditional methods. Dwarven justice, by comparison, is treated with nigh religious reverence. Indeed, Rulic law is intimately tied to the Church of the Great Fathers, and the nation's judges and lawyers are, more often than not, its priests, who deal with most cases of petty or localized crime. Clan lords are often called upon as judges, but they usually defer to priests' advice thanks to their existing responsibilities. Incidents that escalate to involve conflicts between clans, or if a convicted dwarf wishes to appeal their judgment, can be brought before the moot of the 100 houses and or an appointed moot judge, who is invariably very well read in the codex and the laws written within it. Punishments are as perfunctory as trials are formalized, thanks to the dwarven skepticism towards the concept of prisons as a means of rehabilitation. Instead, financial compensation, mutilation, exile, or some combination of the aforementioned is meted out to the guilty offender, with execution if it is considered suitable for the crime. Curiously, though many Ogren live alongside the dwarves of rule and adhere to their laws, Ogren communities do have their own traditional means of dealing with crime amongst themselves. Much of their driving mentality behind such resolution is found in the value attached to the honour of the accused, as well as the impartiality and absolute authority of the presiding judge. This next section we will not dwell on for long, for Crixian justice is simple, arbitrary, and horrifying. In Crix, there is but one law, and in so many words or less, Lord Torok is the law. Obey or die. As to quite how one dies, please do not ponder it for too long. Suffice to say, the priests of Torok and the ruling Iron Liches will use their imagination to inflict great pain on the poor fools that have the ill fortune to be caught up in what passes for a judicial system in the Nightmare Empire. As masters of necromancy, able to use an individual's body and soul, one particularly sadistic punishment Crixians have is corpse binding, which entails death by torture, caging the soul, then raising the corpse and restoring the soul to its corpse. The result is not especially pleasant. Moving on, the systems of the human nations are the most varied, both in terms of interpretation of the law and punishments the law sees fit to mete out. Generalities will be covered, as were one to list every last minute difference between the laws of each nation's many provinces. They would be bored to tears, and so would you. Therefore, generally speaking, the clergy has the most influence in the Protectorate of Menoth, secular justice is harshest in Cador, and the greatest range of itemized crimes and punishments can be found in Signar, at least under the rule of Leto and his successor Julius. Meanwhile, Ord and Llael fall somewhere amongst this simple spectrum. As a state ruled over by the upper echelons of its religious hierarchy, the Protectorate of Menoth is easily stereotyped as the nation of flaming vengeance, and indeed it is a common method of child-rearing to threaten wayward charges with the attention of a scrutator in the more secular countries. The scrutators compose the Protectorate's highest keepers of the law, its enforcers, its executors, and, perhaps most notoriously, its executioners. While they share many punishments with their fellow Iron Kingdoms, Wracking is more or less unique as a death sentence in the Protectorate, and, bewilderingly, a voluntary act of penance in some cases. In the Protectorate, all crimes are associated with one form of heresy or another, and are defined as deprivation of the means to worship Menoth to some degree. This, therefore, means that offence has been given to the Creator and his mortal agents of the Temple. Thus, all punishments are justified as a means to secure his forgiveness. While the practical points of Menite law can be quite complicated, the manner in which they are enforced is anything but complicated, and the scrutators are not an indulgent group, and will pass judgments and punishments with a great deal of severity. Those worthy of redemption are maimed in some way, and or given a heavy flogging, while an irksomely long list of crimes is punishable by death, of the fiery sort. Wracking, though considered a fundamental part of Protectorate justice by the other nations of the Iron Kingdoms, is not as widespread in its use as commonly thought, thanks to the procedural investment required in preparing the incense, monitoring the convicted, and the sheer amount of time it takes for the sentenced to die, which can vary from a few days to a few weeks if they are especially hardy. It is unpleasant in any event. The perception of Cadoran justice is that it is a reflection of their nation, cold and harsh. Even so, under Cadoran law, many crimes are punishable by forced labour, while death sentences are typically the more perfunctory beheading, though they can sentence those guilty of such crimes as piracy, fraud, and arson to hanging instead. Caedoran judges are trained to consider the common good and the good of the nation when delivering their judgments. However, this does contribute to the harshness that they are infamous for, as, for example, bad-mouthing the Empress is punishable by forced labour, justified by the belief that such language can result in genuinely subversive behaviour, and that it is best to nip such conduct in the bud before it can lead to anything material. Such is the credence given to judges in Cador that major cases often involve multiple judges, reflecting the severity of the case, but also that a jury of one's peers is quite a foreign concept there. Reliance on formally appointed judges, though, is not uniform throughout Cador due to the rural lifestyle of a great deal of the population. In more parochial areas, justice is seen through trial by combat, often with champions rather than the respective parties fighting each other. Punishments under Signoran law used to be fairly similar to those of Cador and the Protectorate, when Winter was king, and his inquisition was feared for their uncaring cruelty. The judiciary under Leto has reduced the sentence for virtually all crimes, though the death sentence remains for those considered most severe. The Signoran system does, however, place great trust in its law enforcement, and those arrested by the authorities are assumed guilty until proved innocent. Those brought before judges by other citizens will have better opportunity to argue their case, though. As to the punishments themselves, crimes are more clearly separated into various categories of severity, and a night in the stocks, lenient as it is often the most suitable sentence for such things as profanity, and the scales up to a heavy flogging or forced labour for forging or destroying money. And in addition to death by hanging, executions by drowning or firing squad are also codified punishments, reflecting Signar's naval heritage and military traditions. While most punishments of any legal system can find an extensive history in their use, some have evolved or come about thanks to technology. Thus, in this age of the steamjack, the human nations sometimes sentence those guilty of particularly heinous crimes to what's known colloquially as jacking. It should be noted, though, that this is perhaps more common in Cador, and sometimes extra-legal in its employment. The convicted is tied to the boiler of a steamjack, and a steamjack is set to work, though for the spectacle, the jack merely paces back and forth, though it is doubtful the humiliation adds much to the victim's suffering. The heat of the jack's torso and the movement of its limbs serve to break those of the criminals, and slowly sear their flesh until the ordeal ends, whether in death or being untied from the jack, though one imagines that surviving being jacked is not much consolation. For a faster process, the convicted is strapped with their limbs opposing those of the jack. But such fates appear as nothing compared to what is inflicted on the souls of those captured by the invading infernals. With this recent turmoil that the Iron Kingdoms have found themselves in, where once an enemy is now an ally, even if only through convenience, one wonders how the laws and justice of Immoren's peoples will change when the infernal threat finally ends. That is, if it ends.